Hello and welcome to Module 1 of our all-in-one English Lit Foundation course. And so in our first module, we are going to be looking at essay writing. So the three topics that we'll be looking at in this module are how to structure your essay, how to write concisely, and finally, how to manage your time well, specifically for those exam-timed essay conditions. So let's dive straight into topic 1, how to structure your essay. So in any standard lit essay, there should be 3 sections, and they are the introduction, the main body, and the conclusion. Now, what is the purpose of each section? Why do we have these 3 sections in every essay? Well, for the introduction, the purpose is to inform your reader of the topic you'll be focusing on in the rest of your essay, to contextualize the topic based on the background of the text, and to communicate your main argument towards the topic, which is also called the thesis statement, which we'll get to in the following slides. And then when it comes to the main body paragraphs, they're really to help you explain your argument by looking at different aspects of the topic, and to source the relevant textual evidence, for example, by means of quotations or references in the text, to support your argument. And of course, finally, to analyze the author's use of literary techniques in those textual evidence that you have sourced. Now, a lot of students ask, what does it really mean to analyze the author's use of literary techniques? All that means is thinking about how specific literary devices and stylistic choices help convey the main ideas of a text, right? So it's always about the relationship between the techniques and the topics or themes. And you'll see how this works in practice when we get to the following modules 2 and 3, where I demonstrate how we can analyze a poem and a prose passage. And finally, move on to the conclusion. The purpose is really to summarize your main argument, as well as to zoom out and reflect on the broader contextual significance of the topic. So let's now take a closer look at each of the sections. So any introductory paragraph should consist of mainly 2 parts. They are the context and the thesis statement. Let's first look at what a thesis statement is. Well, a thesis statement is basically your main argument in any essay. Remember, a thesis statement should always be argumentative, not descriptive. So if we're looking at an essay prompt like, in Lord of the Flies, how does William Golding present the breakdown of order on the island? Something like, in Lord of the Flies, Ralph tries to maintain order on the island, but struggles when Jack, his nemesis, seizes power and assumes control over the boys, is a descriptive statement because it literally describes what happens in the story. On the other hand, if we write something like, in Lord of the Flies, Ralph fails to maintain order on the island, largely because the boys fall victim to their primitive desires, which Jack only exploits for his violent and authoritarian ends. Now, if we write something like this, then this would be an argumentative statement because it makes a case for a specific viewpoint, which someone else could argue against. For example, I could say, well, it's actually not because the boys fall victim to their primitive desires, but rather that Jack manipulates the boys. So we see that the first descriptive statement is not good, whereas the argumentative statement is preferred. So now we get on to talking about how to actually write a thesis statement. So step 1 is to ask yourself what you think about the topic or character that's being asked about in the question. So what are your views on how the topic or the character is presented? And then when we move on to step 2, it's really about considering if you can build an argument around your view, right? Can you argue for your view? Do you have the necessary examples to support your argument? And then when we get to step 3, you can summarize the key techniques that the author uses to present the topic or character you will go on to discuss. And of course, these key techniques will relate to the literary and stylistic devices. And so with that, we can produce a thesis statement, which would look something like this. In Lord of the Flies, Ralph fails to maintain order on the island largely because the boys fall victim to their primitive desires, which Jack only exploits for his violent and authoritarian ends. Throughout the novel, Golding presents this through several key techniques, including symbolism, imagery, and narrative shifts, which I will explore in the rest of this essay. So now we move on to talking about context. What is context, right? So context in the study of literature refers to the historical background of a work, and these would include the economic, social, political, cultural, and biographical circumstances. So context is so important when it comes to literature because, number one, it deepens our understanding of the purpose, themes, and messages of a literary work, because we know that authors are always inspired by real-life incidents around them, right? And usually by key socio-political events and cultural shifts. And of course, it's also an exam requirement for you to show contextual awareness in literature essays. A good example of that would be your IB English, where the first assessment objective is to know, understand, and interpret context in which texts are written and or received. So it's very important. So how do we actually include context in our introduction and essay? So the first step to doing this is to actually research the text's historical and biographical background. Of course, this should come in the preparation stage when you are actually revising for your text. And then step two is to summarize the text's historical background or a related cultural concept, and then link it to the topic that's asked in the essay question. Step one, we would do that before we even actually start writing the essay, whereas step two is when we actually given the essay, and that's when we think about all of the historical and biographical knowledge that we know about the text and summarize it as a kind of introductory framework for our essay. Okay, so for example, right, if we think about the context of Lord of the Flies, an important cultural idea that's related would actually be related to two key philosophers. So these two key philosophers are Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So Hobbes was a philosopher who believed that man is born evil and savage, whereas Rousseau believed that man is born good and kind. So these are two opposing views. And in William Golding's novel Lord of the Flies, the theme of good versus evil is very much based on these opposing views, with Ralph being the representative of someone who is born civilized and good, whereas Jack would be the representative of someone who is just born evil and savage. So we see this could be a related cultural concept that underlies our study of Lord of the Flies. An important note before we move on is that we shouldn't only include contextual links in the introductory paragraph, and we should seek to include these links throughout the essay, especially in our analysis section where appropriate. So now we move on to the main body paragraph, right? So any main body paragraph would be made up of a topic sentence, examples or quotations, and also analysis. As a mnemonic, you can kind of remember it as TEA, the TEA structure, topic, sentence, examples, and analysis. So how do we go about structuring a main body paragraph? So first of all, the number of main body paragraphs we would write really depends on the number of ideas you intend to explore in an essay. So this really differs and it depends. And the ideas in the main body paragraph should always stem from your thesis statement. So what do I mean by that? So let's take a look at our thesis statement, right? So just to recall, this is our thesis statement, which we had formulated. And then from this, you can actually branch out into three related ideas. The first idea would be that, well, Ralph, he tries to maintain order, but the boys show early signs of disobedience. And then the second main idea is that, well, as Jack's temptations of meat and hunting grow, the boys gradually start losing their civilized consciousness and give in to their baser desires. And then the final idea would be that Jack sees the boys' weakness for meat and hunting, and so he exploits it to bolster his authoritarian rule. And you see that these three ideas are actually all covered in the thesis statement, but now we're just kind of branching it into a more specific aspect for us to explore. And of course, these three key ideas, the way we phrased it, could also be the topic sentences for each of these main body paragraphs. So remember, Your topic sentence would include the main idea you intend to explore in any given paragraph, okay? But it doesn't have to necessarily just spell out those techniques. The techniques, they can come organically in your analysis. So just to kind of as a recap, right, we'll have the thesis statement branching out into the 3 topic sentences. And then with these 3 topic sentences, we would further go into the evidence and analysis. So with evidence and analysis, it's always about finding the relevant quotations from the book and then identifying the key techniques featured in these quotations you've sourced and discussing how they help convey the idea discussed, right? And so this formula works for all of the main body paragraphs, regardless of what topic or what idea you're going to be exploring in that paragraph. So finally, we move on to the conclusion. So any conclusion should include a summary, but it should actually also include what we call a significance. So what do we mean by that? Let's take a look. So the easiest way to think about the conclusion is a consolidation of your thesis statement and topic sentences. So if we recall, these are our thesis statement and topic sentences. So with our conclusion summary, we would essentially be summarizing all of that we've covered in our thesis and topic sentences. But we're not going to necessarily restate in the same words what we've written in the intro and the main body topic sentences, right? So we're going to paraphrase, and instead we're going to say something like, ultimately, order disintegrates on the island because the boys give in to their baser instincts. Ralph, as the representative of civilized leadership, fails to maintain discipline as the boys gradually defect to Jack's camp, where the primitive temptations of meat and hunting are promised. So you'll see that in my conclusion summary, I am echoing everything I've written in the thesis and topic sentences, but I'm not using the same words verbatim. But as we mentioned just now, there's also something called a significance section. So let's move on to look at how we can add significance to an essay. So the way to think about significance in a lit essay is to zoom out and reframe our essay topic in a broader context. So ask yourself, what do the topic and text tell us about humanity or society at large? It's always about linking it back somehow to human nature or society and the world. So the question here is, what does the disintegration order on the island in Lord of the Flies tell us about human nature? Well, it presents a pessimistic Hobbesian view of human nature. It suggests that in times of crisis, when our characters put on the line, most people will give in to the immediate gratification of desires and place individual interest over the collective well-being, rather than uphold higher morals or make sacrifices for the greater good. And as much as this applied back in World War II, which was the event that had inspired Golding's writing of the novel, the endless cycles of conflict and warfare today continue to reveal man's inclination towards violence and selfishness. So we would add that to our conclusion paragraph so that we get the summary, but also the significance. And so if we're able to bring the significance into our conclusion, that's how we're going to get top grades. Topic 2, how to write concisely. Now, before we dive into the tips, let's quickly address what's probably the most important question. What is it that really makes a good literature essay? Well, in general, a good literature essay should include conceptual clarity and depth, cogent argumentation, as well as concise language. Now, often we think of concise language as its own separate category, being related more to things like grammar, vocabulary, style, etc. But actually, concise language depends on us having attained conceptual clarity and depth, as well as having arrived at a strong cogent argument about whatever topic that's being asked in the question. So it's important that we don't consider these 3 pillars as separate categories. And so with that, let's take a look at our first tip. As I always say, unclear writing is the result of unclear thinking. Too often we think of writing as the act of putting pen to paper, But actually, writing starts in the mind. So thinking is the most important element here. It's great thinking that leads to great writing. So that's why we should always seek to understand before we write anything. So that would be understanding both the topic at hand, the question that's being asked, as well as understanding just exactly what it is that we think about the topic and what is it that we're trying to say. And so good writing ultimately isn't just about the sophistication of your vocabulary or the accuracy of your grammar, but rather it's to do with the depth of your ideas, the cogency of your paragraphs, which refers to the logical flow of your paragraphs, as well as the persuasiveness of your argument. But these three things, depth, cogency, and persuasiveness, only come with clear thinking. Okay, so that's why think before you write, understand before you write. So tip 2 is to focus on the examples in order to be specific. So unclear writing is also the result of being too generic and vague with our points, right? So let's take a look at these two sentences. The poet uses metaphor to express her ideas, versus the poet uses metaphor to compare love with the blossoming of a flower, both being beautiful but fleeting experiences. It's pretty clear that the sentence on the right-hand side is much better than the one on the left-hand side, because the one on the left-hand side is very vague. Express what ideas, right? We don't know. So the key is to engage with the details in the quotations we've sourced from the text. And so being specific doesn't mean stuffing in lots of details. Instead, it's about looking closely at the quotations for meaningful ideas to discuss. Okay, so whenever you think, okay, how can I actually be specific? Well, go back to the text, go back to the examples in the text, and go back to the quotations in the text, and pick out specific words or techniques included in the quotation, and then think about how they help illuminate or convey the ideas that you're trying to discuss, right? And that's how you can start by being specific. So always focus on quality over quantity. Tip 3 is to keep to 1 point per sentence and 1 idea per paragraph. Good writing starts with empathy, and that means putting yourself in the shoes of your teacher and examiner, who may have already read tons of essays before finally getting around to yours. So imagine if your marker has already read 40 essays before actually reading yours. Do you think they want to plow through long sentences and waffly paragraphs just to rack their brains over what you're trying to say? No, even the most good-tempered marker would find this frustrating, and a frustrated marker is bad news for any student. So make sure that you make it as easy as possible for the marker to follow your argument by keeping your clauses, sentences, and paragraphs sharp and focused on one thing at a time. So, for example, we look at these two sentences. Ralph tries to maintain order, but the boys show early signs of disobedience while Jack makes plans to take control of the island, versus Ralph tries to maintain order, but the boys show early signs of disobedience. So these two as topic sentences, which one is better from the marker's perspective? Well, it's probably going to be the one on the right, because it focuses on only one idea. And so you just focus on that one idea in that one paragraph, and then you can leave the second idea, which is, that Jack plans to take control of the island, to another paragraph. Okay, so keeping it sharp and focused is going to be most pleasant for your marker. And tip 4 is to avoid filler words like the plague, right? So filler words are words that don't actually add any value to your writing. Examples of those would include intensifiers, like very, extremely, incredibly, a lot of, unspecified nouns, such as thing, stuff, something, or broad categorical terms like good, bad, positive, negative, etc. You can always find a more specific adjective for good, bad, positive, negative, okay? So, to prevent the use of filler words, make sure you address tips 1 and 2, which is to understand the topic and focusing on the textual details to be specific. Because once you've developed a solid understanding of the topic and the text, you'll be able to source the right quotations and be as specific as necessary in your analysis, and this would remove the need to stuff your essay with those empty filler words. So, as a recap, what are the 4 tips to writing concisely? First, Make sure you understand the topic and, of course, what you think about the topic. Focus on the examples that you've sourced from the text to be specific. Keep to 1 point per sentence and 1 idea per paragraph. Finally, avoid filler words like the plague. So if you follow these 4 tips, you will be sure to write concisely. Topic 3, how to manage your time well. Tip 1 is to plan, plan, plan. Now, please don't rush into writing down the very first idea that comes to mind, because planning your essay is just as important as the actual writing process. Now, too often we rush into writing down whatever first comes to mind because we're terrified of staring at a blank page, and partly because we're scared we'll run out of time if we don't start writing immediately. But ironically, by spending more time on planning, you actually end up saving time on the whole. By outlining the key argument points and examples you want to include in your essay, you're essentially sketching a clear roadmap to guide you through the entire writing journey, which means less chance of you reaching halfway only to realize that your argument doesn't make sense. And also, if you have a solid idea as to what your essay is going to look like from the get-go, then this also lessens your anxiety over what you have to write about once you reach the end of a paragraph. So, the tip is to set aside at least 20% of the total exam time for essay planning. And also, don't be distracted by those frantic scribblers around you, because there's bound to be those people who will rush into writing down the very first idea once the clock starts ticking. You don't want to be them. Instead, you want to stay calm and focused on your task. Remember, just because someone has a head start in writing doesn't mean that he or she will produce a quality essay. So, with a good plan and a calm mind, you are most likely going to trump that frantic scribbler when the results come out. Tip 2. Tip 2 is to practice time chunking. So what's time chunking? Time chunking is the practice of allocating a specific duration to each stage in the writing process. So, for example, when we look at excerpt-based tasks, there would be 5 stages: reading, annotating, planning, writing, and proofreading. Whereas for prompt-based tasks, you're not going to be given an excerpt, so there's only just going to be planning, writing, and proofreading. It's 3 stages. Depending on how long a passage is and how fast a writer you are, you probably want to experiment with the time ratios in your essay practices or mocks, but a reasonable distribution would look something like what's presented here. So with an excerpt-based task, perhaps you would allocate 10% to reading and 5% to annotating. Planning would take up 20%, as we mentioned just now. Writing taking up 60% and proofreading 5%. And for a prompt-based task, again, 20% for planning, writing 75%, leaving behind 5% for your proofreading. And also, you want to stay disciplined and make sure that you keep to the time chunks you've set by placing a watch right in your line of sight. So apart from this obvious function of the watch reminding you of the time, it can also serve as a visual cue to constantly keep you on your toes, so that you'll be less inclined to dawdle and you'll force yourself to move on to another stage once you realize that time for a specific chunk is up. So tip 3, be selective about what to include in your essay. Here's the deal. Your essay is not an encyclopedia, so don't try to stuff in every point under the sun. And no, not even when you spend an entire week memorizing quotations and don't want them to go to waste. It's not about that, because ultimately there is a limit to how much we can write for any essay. Okay, so only pick out the most relevant ideas and quotations for the essay question given. Make sure that you're picking those ideas and quotations that actually help you answer the question, not the ones that you have spent lots of time memorizing, because that ultimately is irrelevant. It's about finding the right examples. And so a good essay plan is going to come in handy here because it will prevent you from information dumping. Because a good essay plan will force you to narrow down your arsenal of information to the most relevant key points, and to be selective by considering why certain quotations or ideas are better for your essay topic than the other ones. So that's why you've got to plan, plan, plan. Yes, I'm going to repeat this again and again like a broken record, because planning is just that important. And finally, tip 4. Now, tip 4 has nothing to do with words, but the non-verbal elements like line spacing and asterisks. A good tip is to space out your handwriting by skipping lines liberally, because this allows you to add in last minute information when you review, and it also makes the proofreading process easier. You'll have enough space if you ever want to cross out words without having to squish in those new ones. Asterisks, which is the star sign, can also be helpful as a way for you to indicate additional or amended information. As long as you indicate the sentences you want to change with a legible asterisk sign and reference that very clearly with a corresponding asterisk at the bottom of the same page or at the very end of your essay. Just make sure that you mark out everything clearly and don't overuse this, because ultimately, remember, it's about making your marker's experience of reading your essay as pleasant as possible. So you don't want to lead them on a wild asterisk goose chase. So to recap, 4 tips to manage your time well. Plan, plan, plan. Practice time chunking. Be selective about what to include in your essay. And make good use of line spacing and asterisks. And there you go, guys. That's it. Well done for completing Module 1 on essay writing. We can now move on to the next module.